Roman arms.
Long ago, we resolved to serve neither the Romans nor anyone other than God himself. We have never submitted to slavery, and we must not now. Let our wives die unabused, our children without any knowledge of slavery. Ben Yair.
They drew lots, choosing 10 men from among them who would slay all the rest. Then they offered their necks to the stroke of those who executed that melancholy task. And he who was last of all examined those who lay on the ground, and with a great force of his hand ran the sword into his body up to the hilt.
During the long night, more than 900 devout Jews turned their swords on themselves.
When the Romans came upon the rows of dead bodies, they did not exult over them as enemies, but admired their resolve, and the way so many of them had shown an utter contempt of death in taking their own lives without a tremor.
Revolts like Masada posed no real threat to Rome's supremacy, but they began to spark a change in the military's role. Scattered uprisings continued to trouble the empire, little by little turning Rome's great army of conquest into an army of occupation. Trajan was the last Roman emperor to substantially add to the empire. Under his rule in 117 AD, the Roman Empire reached 2 million square miles. Trajan added modern-day Romania, Armenia, and lands to the east, expanding the empire to its greatest size ever. He briefly held territory as far east as the Persian Gulf. The legions now patrolled a vast frontier, from the edge of the Sahara Desert to the frigid Carpathian Mountains. From this point onward, Rome concentrated on shoring up her empire. The days of conquest were over. It was the Emperor Hadrian who formalized this policy.
Hadrian gets a sense of unease that he has pushed the empire out to its limits, and he did two things. He pulled the army back from its overextension, and then he built a series of beautifully engineered fortifications.
The most famous of these barriers is Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, where remains of the 73-mile-long chain of forts still stand nearly 2,000 years later. But walls proved only partially successful against a threat that would torment the Roman Empire until the very end. The Romans have a single word for all peoples without a written language. They call them barbarians.
We tend to think of the barbarians as a collection of Conan the Barbarian and his buddies coming across the frontier waving their double-handed axes. This is quite far from the truth. By the time the barbarians come across the frontiers, they're beginning to be Romanized. What these people wanted first and foremost was a place within the empire for themselves.
No one knows exactly why they began to pour into southern Europe during the 2nd century AD. Perhaps climate changes or population growth. Perhaps the lure of the empire itself brought tribe after tribe into Rome. Little by little, pressure mounted on nearly every frontier. When German tribes attacked Rome's borders in 166 AD, it marked a bleak milestone. For the first time since Hannibal's invasion, the Roman Empire was on the defensive. For the next century, wave after wave of migrating peoples followed the Germans into Roman territory. Goths, Franks, Persians, Parthians, Visigoths, and more. And the edges of the empire would crumble until there was no more Roman Empire to penetrate. The dam had sprung not one, but 1,000 leaks. And by the 3rd century AD, barbarians were only one of the empire's mounting crises. It was a time when an emperor was far more likely to be assassinated than die of old age, and rulers frequently left no clear successor to the throne. Once again, the affections of the individual legions became central to political power.
There came a point where the loyalty of the army became suspect, particularly in the 3rd century AD, when the empire, faced by barbarian incursions on the frontiers, faced by plague, by rampant inflation, some armies proclaimed their own commanders emperor and then marched on Rome, trying to seize power.
It was a recipe for anarchy and disaster. Feuding legions proclaimed 30 different emperors in a period of just 23 years. Civil wars broke out frequently over who the true emperor was.
Throughout much of the 3rd century, Roman armies were often engaged in fighting one another rather than in guarding the frontiers and protecting the security of the empire as a whole.
The period of the so-called barracks emperors, the period of military anarchy, is a very interesting period to modern scholars, because I think what it shows is moral collapse of the military leadership in the Roman Empire. And it's a question of allegiance. If the army becomes more important than the state, then ultimately both the army and the state are doomed. And that's a terrific lesson for all of us in this day and age.
Meanwhile, Rome's impressive record in battle was slipping. Apparently, the great legions had lost their edge.
Many people are very keen to criticize the Roman army in the 3rd century because it suffered military defeat after military defeat. But we do need to remember that the Roman army had not fought an offensive battle for nearly a century. The Roman army had been patrolling the frontiers, not fighting wars.
The low point came in 260 AD. The Emperor Valerian has spent his entire career fighting the Persians to the east with limited success. With his troops ravaged by war and disease, he's forced to do something no emperor has ever done: negotiate. But when Valerian arrives in modern-day Iraq to talk peace, he's taken prisoner. The emperor of the Roman Empire is made to kneel down on the ground before his conquerors, so the Persian king Shapur can step on his neck. It's a devastating blow to Roman pride.
Shapur took the defeated Valerian back to his capital, and there, when he died, had him flayed, his skin dyed crimson, and he was stuffed and displayed in the chief temple. For Romans, it was a symbol of their utter military humiliation at the hands of a foreign power.
It was not the end for Rome, not yet. But it was the beginning of the end. The Roman legions were no longer the invincible fighting machine that once conquered the world. The frontiers of the empire were no longer impenetrable. And Rome herself could no longer be said to rule the world. Less than a century after the first barbarians crossed into the empire, one ancient Roman saw this momentous time for what it was.
Our history now plunges from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust.